Well, good morning. Happy Monday. So glad that you could join us today. Apologies for being a minute late. It is a Monday morning, but we're so delighted everyone could join us today. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Our webinar today is The Real Economy for Board Directors. Our challenge will be that we only have 60 minutes. I believe we could talk much longer than that this morning on this topic, but we will do our best to limit it to the 1 hour for our webinar today. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button on Zoom. And please do so throughout today's webinar. Dan, our moderator, will fold those questions in throughout today's session. We are recording the session today, so we will have it available on our website at a later date, and I will send an email out when that is available. And without further ado, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists for today and give a very brief introduction before we begin today's session. Kevin Depew is Deputy Chief Economist for RSM US LLP. Kevin also leads the firm's Industry Eminence Program, overseeing a team of 60 industry analysts. He was previously involved with Minionville Media, an online financial media and publishing company, where he was awarded an Emmy for his work on an animated show helping viewers better understand financial markets. Tim Mahady is founder and chief economist at Access Micro. He spent 12 years as an economist, economic business consultant, and sought-after speaker, and also has extensive public policy experience, having worked as a forecaster at the International Monetary Fund and Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO founder and entrepreneur and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chairman of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Tim, thank you to Kevin, thank you to Dan, and take it away, Dan.
Great, thanks very much, Nancy. So first, I have to modify my bio just a little bit. We tend to tuck away and hide the economist part of it. I'm originally trained as an economist. I was the economist guy, the finance guy at the law school. But since we're among economists, I don't have to hide it here. No shame today. So thank you for that. I do want to highlight one thing, though. So if you're paying attention, Nancy, who actually is in charge, runs the show, makes sure it all works. Behind the scenes is actually orchestrating things that people may not realize. So please do not discount the power of Nancy, which is all powerful. We have 3 guys, which is super rare, by the way, for us to have a panel in SVDX. I want to highlight is not for trying. I do believe that the women academic economists and women industrial economists and women banking economists are all having a secret meeting today because no one, and I mean no one, was available. So I just want to acknowledge that. It's actually quite rare for SVDX to have an all-guy panel. We have more all-women panels than we have all-guy panels. Less than 2% of our panels are all men. But be that as it may, I'm super glad to have you guys here. And when we do the follow-up, we'll make sure we get one of those folks who is conflicted and not available. So we have many, many things to talk about. I want to open it with kind of an odd question, but at least I previewed it for you. And that is kind of reversing the order. What is the one thing that you would like everyone to please stop talking or speculating about with regard to the economy? So it can be anything, but preferably something that people do tend to waste their time, in your opinion, probably speculating or talking about. And you can either be that way because there's just no way to talk about it effectively, so it's just wasting everyone's time, or it is the wrong question or the wrong answer. That's always a nice, framing. So let's start there, and then I'm going to walk us through kind of laying the groundwork of what's going on, what should boards know, how do they know more, that kind of stuff. But who wants to go first? Tim, you want to kick it off with please stop talking about or thinking about or listening to this topic, and here's why.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Kevin, great to see you. Nancy, thank you so much. This is a well-timed question. I've been on a 5-day crusade, and let me tell you why. So I'm a former Fed guy. I did forecasting for John Williams, who's now in New York, and then Mary Daly. And one of the things that I have long struggled with the Fed, and some folks inside the Fed also struggle with, is what happened last Wednesday. So March, June, September, December, along with the rate decision, the Fed releases what's called the Summary of Economic Projections. That is a list, a set of data that is supposed to give you some sense of what the Fed thinks numerically. Here's the problem. It makes a bunch of headlines. People misunderstand what it is. They misunderstand how you get there, and it dominates everything. So let me give you an example. So if you looked at Wednesday, what all the headlines said, they said, oh, Fed still has 3 rate cuts in their forecast. That's because of statistics. So that's the way that SEP works is you have 19 people submitting different forecasts that come from very different places. And then they take the median of that forecast, they line everything up and they take the middle and they say, that's the median forecast for the FOMC. And everyone says, look, this is what the collective FOMC thinks. Here's a problem with that. If you look at the distribution of those forecasts, then what happened was all the forecasts for folks that were on the lower end, they thought there'd be more cuts this year, all moved up. Nobody moved down. The median stayed the same because if you lined them up, you still got the middle. So what does that tell you? It tells you that a lot more people are worried about inflation than they thought, but because everyone focused on 1 or 2 data points as opposed to the distribution, it got very confusing as to what the Fed was actually trying to convey. And I would even say that statement's misleading. They're not trying to convey anything. It's just like a mix of forecasts. So if I'm going to get on my soapbox here and I'm really going to shake the tree, I'm going to say either don't pay attention to the SEP because I think it is misleading, particularly the point estimates, or just look at the underlying data or have an economist help you understand, if you're not quite familiar with it, how those underlying data points work. The distributions and the changes are important. The actual point estimates on inflation or monetary policy or GDP growth are incredibly misleading, and that's what makes all the headlines. It is not a consensus view of the FOMC. It is not like they all got together and said 3 rate cuts. It is a statistical, technical thing that sometimes can give you some insight, but oftentimes doesn't, but always gets reported. So if I'm going to get on my soapbox, I'm going to say, let's stop talking about the SEP.
I love that. That is okay. That's the best kickoff answer to my favorite question ever on any webinar we've done. So thank you for that. I'll hang that award in my office until someone bumps you, which could take a very long time. I want to highlight 2 things that we'll come back to. One, the median or separately different average hardly ever reflects the true contours of complex matters, not the least of which is finance, the economy, macroeconomics. So that's a lesson just to be internalized and held in your head all the time. But and I think that's part of what you're saying. But there's another point here which I think directors on boards and all of us, but it's acute, I think, for directors on boards have, and that is attenuation of analysis, data, and understanding. What I mean by that is you can imagine the way the headlines became the headlines and the summaries became the summaries and the talking heads points became the talking heads points is because the data was the data and it moved and it's available to everybody, right? But no one actually goes, except for the likes of you and sometimes me, to look at that data and notice this trend, which was, what really happened was the sentiment for the kind of easy money folks, and so sentiment changed, meaning stay the same. And so we don't look at that, but someone summarizes that and that gets picked up. And the way news journalists work sometimes for complicated matters is they then pick up the phone, often to an academic economist or someone like you, and they only give you about a minute and they only take about 10 seconds of that, right? So you get this like step-by-step attenuation. Then of course the talking heads probably reflected on something that they read in Bloomberg, right? Or saw on CNN, and that's even further attenuated. And then someone who's a consultant/analyst puts that together and then briefs the board, right? So you got this massive attenuation from like source data, and yet as a board member, it's impractical for you to go digging down all the way to the source. So this is a problem in everything, not just economics and finance and macro. But I'd like you, as we go through, maybe to reflect on either where that problem is particularly dangerous and present, and maybe, I don't have an answer to this, it'd be great if you did, how to solve it periodically. So my answer is, I stay up late, and for things I care about a lot, like a CBO report on the Federal Home Loan Bank System, I click all the way through the biography and find the source document from 1975 and then agree or disagree with their interpretation. But none of us have time to do that for everything. So we're going to come back to that, the attenuation of critical information for boards, in this case, finance. All right, I've given you enough time, Kevin, that you need to wow us with your choice of what to stop talking about, what to stop asking.
Oh, I think there's nothing I like more than to strike from the list the things that we don't want to talk about.
All right, I like it.
I will say that that from my perspective, and I think this goes directly to board considerations, there are 2 issues that people love to talk about and speculate about, and they fall into those buckets that they're issues that we have probably very little control and very little influence over. So the first one would be that comes up frequently is the dollar is going to lose its status as the global reserve currency, and I think that that's In our lifetimes, at least, it's pretty far-fetched. Historically, we know that nothing lasts forever. So, but I don't think in the lifetimes that we're concerned about, and certainly at the board level, that is something I would take off the list. The second one that comes up, because they're related, is this idea of debt dynamics in the U.S. as an economics issue. I think the debt dynamics are a political issue, to be sure, and a contentious one. But I want to segment that and separate that away from the economics issue. I mean, the bottom line is total U.S. household wealth is near 155 trillion versus 34 trillion in debt. So we are a wealthy nation. We can afford to do stuff. And what we need to have conversations about are the policy implications and what those mean and what our preferences are. So, it's a large country, and there are a wide array of considerations when you're talking about policy preferences. And I wouldn't suspect that, as somebody who is middle-aged, that my policy preferences are going to be the same as someone who is already retired or someone who is just coming up. So those are the two issues: the fiscal posture. I don't want to say it doesn't mean that we want to ignore it completely, but that's a political issue, and we need to have those conversations versus talking about it from an economics perspective.
That's great. I really like those. And you've added a third complexity of interpretation and information kind of veracity beyond the attenuation and everything else. And that is politicization, right? So certain topics are subject disproportionately, let's say, to certain political dynamics, which then perhaps distort them, purposefully or otherwise. And it makes it even harder to kind of sort through the difference. And I would say that dominance of the dollar and, fiscal and debt dynamics are particularly attractive to political discourse, and not in a good way.
That's part of the cycle.
It's hard to sort the noise from the signal. Although I think what you're saying, by the way, is for us in the short term, there's not a whole lot of signal there. Don't get fixated on it. So I like that. Okay, well, that's interesting. So we've set aside the things we gravitate to and try to understand the Fed with. Okay, don't do that. And we've said, don't worry about the dollar and don't worry about debt. I know I'm exaggerating, but so I guess the next question is, well, what's left? What should we be paying attention to? And I think I'm gonna turn to you, Tim, to kind of answer what was kind of the original question, which is, what must we understand? If you've only got 43 minutes left for this session, if we don't get to and lay the groundwork for A, B, and C, or it might just be A and B, we will have done everyone a terrible disservice. What would those things be? And then I'll turn to you, Kevin, and then we'll kind of synthesize a little bit.
Let me bring two things together, Dan. So let's talk about the end of what you talked about around information flow. That is a really fascinating point. My second time at the Fed, I'm going to get to the economics question, I promise. My second time at the Fed, I was Mary Daly's chief of staff. So that's an organization of 1,700 people, and what my job was to help information flow into the office. So why am I saying that? It's exactly, in all organizations, it's the same thing. It's a game of telephone, right? The folks at the bottom see it. As it trickles up the line, the attenuation gets worse, and then you're sitting there in a room with a one-page sheet that should have been a 50-page document, because who can read 50 pages 40 times, right? That's a constant information flow issue. So with that, though, the way I like to think about the economy is start at the end, right? So I have hopefully, and Kevin, I'm sure has done the same thing, we have hopefully just kind of summarized what we a summary of the economy. And in the spirit of that, I have one question I talk to people about. The only question in my mind, or the most important question at this moment, is, what do economic fundamentals look like? Are they the same as 2019 or better? That question, in my view, should kick off everything that we think about. Why? Because there are two facts we know. Policy is too tight. That means the Fed has raised rates to a level that is restrictive. Now, the question is how restrictive, and we'll get to that. The second question there is, what is the underlying growth rate in the economy, the potential growth rate? Those things move together. Higher potential growth means you've had more investment, more labor supply growth. That means a higher potential growth rate and a higher equilibrium real interest rate, which means the economy can absorb more interest rates. You have to cut less to avoid a recession. That's the better than 2019 scenario. If the economy looks very similar to 2019, potential growth is the same as it was back before the pandemic, then we're like 2 percentage points at least too tight, and we're just running through a bunch of fiscal tailwinds that came through the pandemic. The federal government dumped a bunch of money in the economy. We're running out of that. Consumer spending, while okay, looks like it might be slowing a bit. There was some concerning labor market data at the state level, not the federal level yet. So are these reasons to say there's a recession coming? No. But if you start with that single question of better fundamentals or the same, it leads you to kind of figure out where are we in the decision tree, right? And so in our view at this moment, it's 50-50 for a recession. We have a very high recession call. And the reason for that is we have yet to see all of the things we would need to see to think that the potential economy is getting better. There are signs, which is why it's not 70. It was a 70% recession probability 3 months ago. There are signs things are improving, but there's still some real risks out there. And let's also say, I'll say this is the last thing and then I'll stop talking. My wife says I can talk for hours. I'll try not to do that on this. But what I will tell, the last thing I'll say is our best economic data is last month. That's the best stuff. Sometimes we're talking last quarter. So when we're thinking about the economy, you have to take the stuff that's happened and look into the future. And so and economists argue all the time about which of those things we should look at. But the labor market is somewhat real time. It's not a great forward-looking indicator of where we're going to go. So I toss out discussion on labor market. Industrial production can be okay. Really what's concerning to me is the yield curve, and that's still inverted. So those, just to lay out that one question, look at the risk, what should you pay attention to? That's how I would think about the economy.
Great. And you've added one more dynamic to our information dysfunction, and that is delay, right? So beyond attenuation, you have attenuation and time shift. And the greater the time shift, the worse it is. And I would suggest, by the way, mixing and matching makes it even more confusing. You got the latest data. It turns out some of it's 2 quarters old, because that is the latest data. Some of it's 1 quarter old, and some of it's a month old. And then we kind of pretend it's all from the same time frame, which is very scary. Okay, well, I think the headline there is 50-50 on recession, by the way. So I think we're going to come back to that, because this is the predictive environment for the last 2 years that just favors no one. Like I actually, there's an old joke in finance when we teach about frauds, where once upon a time you could have a very sophisticated fraudster, and they would always pick on doctors, by the way, because they have just enough income, and they would send out 1,000 letters that said, hey, you don't know me, but I'm going to predict that the following 5 stocks go up, and it's going to happen this way, blah, 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 and, I hope you pay attention. Anyway, the way you do it is they send out 50-50 each time, up, down, and over time, after enough letters, you still got, 20 where you got it right every single time, and you look like a genius. So even at a randomized level right now, those people who are just, it's so bouncy that I don't think there are any lucky predictors. Like across 2 years, you at least end up with someone who you look at and say, well, I don't know if they're a genius, but they were lucky. They got it right every time. But it's been so hard to predict that I would say, I don't know anybody who's prominent and lucky right now. So with that as a setup, Kevin, you can have your own philosophy here, or you can play off of Tim's, but I am going to force us to come back to this 50-50 on the recession thing. But go ahead, Kevin.
Well, so we're a little more optimistic. Our recession
Thank goodness. Okay, thank you for that. No.
Yeah, our recession probability model, similar to Tim's, I'm sure a year ago was much higher, near the 70%. But we have taken that down to 15%. And there are a couple of things going on to influence that. It's to your point about the difficulty in forecasting. You think about it from the time the Fed began raising rates in this very accelerated fashion as part of their interest rate increase cycle. There is somebody that has been on television or in the media every single day over that 22, 23-month period saying, not only are we likely to go into recession in the next 6 to 12 months, but that we're probably in a recession right now. Right. And, so I understand, part of that alarming nature of those calls is related to our most 2 recent experiences with recession. Both were all hands on deck, everything stops at once. One was a public health emergency, a pandemic that hopefully won't be repeated again for another 100 years, if not longer. Going back to prior to that recession, it was a financial crisis, and a literal financial crisis, the worst since the Great Depression. So, and it was one of those crises where everything stops at the same time. So there's no asymmetry to the slowdown as Chair Jerome Powell has warned about in the way a typical recession unfolds. And so I think it's very challenging for businesses and firms to get their heads around, look, if you have a 20-year track record, that's a long time, but you've experienced two extraordinary recessions that are unlikely to be duplicated. Much more likely is that we get either a geographical recession that doesn't morph into a national recession related to the composition of industry in a specific area, or that we get an industry-specific recession. So, over the last 18 months or so, I definitely wouldn't be sitting down with manufacturers, for example, and saying, what are you worried about? Everything's fine, because their industry has certainly been in a recession and is only now beginning to try to slowly recover from it. Similar to residential real estate, any of the consumer products ecosystems or durable goods that feed into those volumes of home transactions that we saw certainly in the post-pandemic days that slowed considerably with the higher interest rates. I wouldn't tell them that things are all rosy either. So I guess the biggest issue that we have is we've kind of landed in an environment over the last year and a half or so where it's the best economy or the worst economy, and there's no room for anything in between. And the reality is that most economies are somewhere in between. They're neither the best nor the worst. And it just so happens that because of our experience with those extraordinary events, 2008, and then with the pandemic, that we kind of are looking for that, So that's one reason that we think we kind of just muddle through. That as the farther we go along in what will ultimately be deployment stage for things like generative AI and hopefully some of the productivity that follows on those longer term, that we have the capacity to grow with a higher rate environment, understanding that higher for longer, we have to take the Fed at its word there. And even if they do engage in our forecast this year is 3 interest rate cuts, in the real economy, you're not likely to feel that, say, 75 basis points, or even if it's more aggressive and 150 basis points, you're unlikely to feel that relief in your borrowing costs. There's something we forgot about called the term premium, and the term premium is probably going to reappear, and so that means that, well, a fair range for the 10-year Treasury is probably 4 to 5%, exactly where we've been for most of the last 12 months or so.
Great. Thank you. It's interesting. Your industry-specific analysis about weak spots sort of highlights the theme that maybe Tim started, which is don't look at the averages and the medians as a practical matter for purposes of what you want to do. If you're going to get even a little granular, if you're a director and you're sitting in the manufacturing sector, don't take reassurance from the low unemployment rate on average and from the economic growth on average, right? You really do need to, and I guess I say that out loud almost because it doesn't need stating. That seems so obvious, but on the other hand, there's so much coverage of the economy that never goes sector specific. Maybe commercial real estate in the last few quarters has gotten its own specific mention a bit, but beyond that, I don't think you actually, unless you're looking for it, get really sector specific stuff. And I think that's a really good takeaway. We're gonna I think eventually kind of go to questions from the audience. I want to encourage people to throw us questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll weed them in where I can, and we'll make sure we leave time for them. But I do want to go through a couple other areas just to lay a little bit more groundwork. And this one, I'm going to get at it from a different angle than I had prepped us for. So we're gonna give you enough time to think it through. We talked about the fact that there's lots of policy and other issues that can drive the economy and are impacting the economy. So we already mentioned one, AI. We mentioned another indirectly, labor and immigration. I think we'll want to come to those, but let me go at it in a different direction, which is in the last couple of weeks, it's almost a hedge for folks who are expert. They talk about, well, here's what we think, and then they put a caveat. And I want to have you guys talk about this notion of a caveat in general, and then I'm going to get specific. The caveat is, quote unquote, exogenous shocks that are unexpected. Right? So it's like, well, I'm predicting the following, unless there's unless there's a war, a thing, and then they list 9 things. I'm like, when is there ever been a quarter or two where one of those 9 things doesn't happen? So your prediction comes with like a big asterisk that says, and I don't know, right? So I'm exaggerating and being maybe a little unfair, but like, can you talk to us about this idea of exogenous shock, and is it not incorporated generally into most people's predictions? Like, you kind of have that a little bit. And then let's dig into some of those. Maybe you're willing to list a few. Like, I'm going to list my current pet peeve, which is a little under the radar, but because it's all out in the open. So Steve Miller is the architect of candidate Trump's immigration policy. He was on board last time, and he has a very particular flavor. Without getting into the politics of it, I happen not to agree with that immigration policy at all, but it's actually out in the open. There's a blueprint, there's some documents, so you kind of know what's going to happen. And I would suggest it's arguably an exogenous shock, although it won't be exogenous, it'll be self-inflicted, which is there will essentially be a suspension of all immigration, legal and illegal, on day one based on executive order. And so while things get sorted out, it could go on for 3 months or 6 months or a year or two, but basically all immigration will come to a halt. And this, I think this has some supporters. It has, some detractors. And then I think most everyone's not paying enough attention to know that that's actually in the blueprint. So I'm going to call that an exogenous shock, where on one day, suddenly, boom, immigration policy changes. And I want you to talk about it. Feel free to talk about it however you want. But I really kind of want to know your labor take on that. Like, what's that do? Is that a shock to the system? Do we care? Should we not care? And I wanted to say maybe about, AI a little bit, ways to think about commodity fluctuation prices, if wars happening in different parts of the world expand or maybe suddenly resolve, that kind of thing. So either one of you, tell us what you think about when people say exogenous shock, and then maybe pick one of those and give us your thoughts.
Kevin, is it okay if I jump in?
Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So let me go back to information flow for a second, because I want to bang on a drum. This is part of the reason I started my company. Economists, we all do it. We get stuck on point forecasts. The reason that's dangerous is because what I tell clients is like, look, it's like baseball. If you bat 300 in your forecast over time, you're going to the Hall of Fame, right? That's 30% right. So those are your best forecasters. I don't care how many times you go on Twitter and someone says, I predicted the last 4 financial crises. Here's the thing, they predicted 25 in between that you don't remember, right? So you're playing around bias. So we all have to start with, our point forecasts, going back to the SEP, are not great. So how do you want to think about the economy? As a director, how do you want to think about this? You want someone that helps you build understanding. We want to talk about not just the scenarios, but why we have those scenarios. And so to get to your question, Dan, I think you hit the nail on the head. Right. So if it just in this spirit of understanding, why do labor markets matter? Why does immigration matter? Why does AI matter? Let me answer 2 of those things at the same time. So I said the only question that matters to us at Access Macro is the economy or economic fundamentals better than 2019 or the same? If they're better, let's go to the better spot. If they're better for one of 3 reasons, or all 3 of them. I guess you got them all at the same time. Potential GDP growth is higher. Right, that's the first prerequisite you need to get a stronger economy. What drives an upswing in potential GDP? Labor supply growth, capital investment, productivity. Productivity is AI. We can have that discussion. I'm sure we could have 2 hours of that discussion. Another one, though, and this is interesting, it's recently been picked up, is labor supply growth. So if you go, what is that? That's immigration, that's birth rates. If you go and you look at the congressional budget offices, that's the research arm of Congress, if you look at their forecast for labor supply growth in 2023, early 2023, versus what just came out, they doubled. I've never seen this before. They doubled their forecast for labor supply growth over the next 4 years. A lot of that is because of immigration. So that means you have a whole bunch of people coming in legally and undocumented into the economy. That's a huge boom to at least short-term potential GDP, right? So if you get your scenario where they shut off, Trump is elected and they shut the valve off in early January, that whole tailwind to potential growth stops. And that's a huge risk to this discussion around, are we in a better or same economy? That's a big deal. The same could be said of AI. If you go back and look at history of, like, Bob Gordon, who's a professor at Northwestern, has a 900-page tome on this, but he looks at like technological innovation over hundreds of years in Western society. We know one thing, that is that those technological innovations take decades to dissipate through the economy. Now, we're not at the beginning of AI. AI has been around longer than the headlines will let you know. But are we at a spot where it's completely diffusing throughout the economy? I'm not convinced of that yet. So there's definitely upward. I think it will be a big deal, but I don't know if we're quite there yet. We may actually be on the part where everyone's a little bit tired of it and are kind of like, the first things I try with AI aren't working, so I'm going to put it on the shelf and think about it later. There's some headlines about that. So that's to say there are two big important things that could make the economy better than it was in 2019, and both of those may be slowing down, or in your case, Dan, shutting off. And so in that sense, that's how you should think about the economy in our view. Think about what the drivers are, what those drivers mean, and then you can do, get to what Kevin did, which was fantastic, and talk about the different sectors, right? Because then you can start to think about, where is that immigration going to shut off? Where does that matter? It's not ag, right? It's going to be in some of these high valued kind of tech stuff. So I'll stop myself there, but that's we work, and I think everyone that does this consulting piece works on building understanding around the economy and how to think about it.
That's great. And Kevin, I'm going to have you jump in. Let me just tease out a couple points so people who are following can kind of, have them fix their mind and maybe have a follow-up question. So please, and I see there's some questions coming in. I'll definitely turn to them, and I think we addressed one of them. So one of the points you made, which I think is really interesting, Tim, is this diffusion of innovations and technologies, and how long does it take, and how quick, and it feels like a lot rides on the assumption of the speed of diffusion. And so someone asked, hey, what can directors ask beyond this generalization stuff? And one of them is, if you have a understanding of how a technology will impact a relevant industrial sector for you, focus on diffusion and depth, right? And get an understanding of that. If it's moving really slowly relative to all the headlines, well, then that's one effect. On the other hand, if someone says, oh, for our sector, because the average workforce is 12 years younger than the workforce in general, it's moving fast. Like, if they have a story, that's very helpful. The director can kind of act on that. I have a saying which sadly has not been picked up, so it's probably just my saying, and that is, don't turn your back on a geometric progressive curve. And what I mean by that is, like, when people get tired, they're like, these computers, like, call it 1991. These computers, they don't work very well. They don't do much. I might as well just do this stuff myself, right? Or the early true World Wide Web internet, call it 1996. It's like, this thing is ridiculous. There's nothing good on here, right? And people kind of turn their back, but it's progressing really quickly. Perhaps a genuine geometric curve. It's like doubling every whatever. I feel like AI is a little bit like that, and we are at the early adopter dissatisfaction phase, right? Where the people who think it's just cool when it does anything, even if it's wrong, like hallucinations, that's so cool. And then there's the practical people who are like, I cannot use any of this answer if it makes up crap 10% of the time. So this is stupid, and they set it aside. And heaven forbid you ignore it for 2 years. Because in 2 years, right? So don't turn your back on a geometric curve. So I like you highlighting AI for that reason, where some people are surprised when things turn out to be so powerful. So we'll come back to that, because it implicates some fast moving things. Like, does it move fast or slow? Feels like a lot of the answer to what are going to be the implications in the economy for these things. And maybe we can dig at that. And we have some questions about the Fed and some other things that we're going to come back to for both of you, but I haven't forgotten those. We'll come back to them. But Kevin, what about you? Like, this idea of exogenous shocks, should we think about it a particular way? And do you have one or two that you want to highlight?
Well, yeah, the exogenous, it's like the geopolitics, right? There's, you can always find something in the geopolitical realm that's going to be a tremendous risk, and usually you run those out when you're not sure about what the risks are. What we're more concerned about from our perspective are the things that, what are the internal shocks? Those tend to be the ones that create the deepest recessions, because it's something going on internal in your economy that could be problematic. And the good news is that we don't see a lot of those. What we see are the potential.
Can you give us an example of one? That makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
But what's
so think about the recession in early 2000s that people sometimes equate that with the dot-com crash, but it was really a corporate debt bubble and over leverage in the corporate sector that resulted in a recession. A combination of leverage did that in the late 70s. And then you had the simultaneous headwinds around that time, the exogenous shock that created the oil crisis, the oil embargo, and so all those things that kind of melded together to create deep recessions. A more garden variety recession, one that could be because of an external factor. So, for example, if China's unwind becomes a little more unruly, and that starts to have a knock-on effect to emerging markets, or a knock-on effect to places like Germany, then that could create additional headwinds for our industrial sectors, for example. All of those things are non-trivial. If you're in those industries, that's a very important thing to understand. But again, we just keep coming back to that, even with the immigration, I agree with Tim's point. It's unfortunate that conversation is mixing two things. One, what the crisis at the border with illegal immigration and the influx in those communities that are creating challenges around services and housing and everything else. And then legal immigration, which there's broad bipartisan support for coming to terms with some kind of legal immigration reform that can alleviate our pressures, because at the board level, guess what? Now we got to look at wage growth that's running about 4% plus year over year versus our experience prior to the pandemic when it was 1 to 1.5%. Now, under conditions where you're looking at your operations, you're trying to maintain margins and you're trying to grow faster and find the labor to do that with labor force participation for your prime age workers near an all-time high, then those headwinds are unlikely to resolve without some meaningful movement. And it could come from a variety of factors, So, again, that's what would be worrisome to me at the board level is what is the impact on wages of these policy outcomes? And then I want to segregate, or I want to segment the illegal immigration issues with how do we create the conditions for more favorable legal immigration that can help our high-skilled workers that we need to do things longer term. So if you're thinking about, I think I heard David Autor put it this way, that in some businesses you're hiring crossing guards, and that's a certain wage level and a certain lowered skill set versus air traffic controllers, which the training is much more, much longer, much higher paying jobs. And so who are you hiring? And this is a combination of both. And those are what you need to think about in terms of the labor supply availability longer term. Demographically, we don't have our organic labor supply that's going to be keeping up with even nominal employment growth over the next decade. So that's the issue.
That's a really good example. I'm going to use that because the crossing guards
I stole it from him.
and the air traffic controllers, we have an acute shortage of both. And both have to do with controlling large vehicles moving quickly, and if you don't do it well, they kill people. So, and one is arguably a lesser skilled rapid deployment, and another is a very sophisticated, long-term developed skill. I like that very much. I appreciate you, by the way, separating. I'll say it again just because you did it so nicely. There is the border and border control security issues, which is its own thing. It's obviously entangled with everything, but it is its own set of very, very difficult problems. There is then, lawful legal immigration and the calibration and connection of that to the needs of the economy, arguably, and some other issues. And then there is a broader set of immigration, both lawful, which is maybe family-based, which, is one thing. And then there's undocumented people who arrive in the United States and generally, by the way, do work at a higher rate than people who enter the United States to work, which is sort of a weird irony of all of that. And if I'll throw out and maybe we'll include it in the information, if you want to dig into that information more, there is a well-respected, nonpartisan, there are very few left, nonpartisan entity of which I'm affiliated, so I should say I'm a former chair, called the American Immigration Council. They do economic analysis. They merged with the New American Economy, which was the local and state economy and analytics group that did all sorts of amazing stuff about the economy. So I think before we switch to the bigger picture, we've gotten several questions, a couple comments to dig in on both AI and immigration. And before we leave let's cover immigration just for maybe 2 more minutes, just because labor immigration, it really is a big deal for the economy. And it feels like it's something that's sort of tangible, a little bit more knowable for directors, even if they don't know a lot about it right now. So we have a question that's pretty specific. It says, hey, wouldn't more immigration be good for ag at least, right? Document, undocumented, whatever. Isn't population growth, upside a good thing for agriculture? But I'm going to put it more generally and ask you both to comment, because I know you both have expertise in this. So it is my understanding that generally speaking, for a late stage post-industrial modern economy like ours, any immigration of young people, so call it under 35, any immigration of law-abiding young folks is a net good. There's almost no caveats. One of the biggest threats to our overall economic security is the aging of our population and our eligible workforce. Can you expand on that, including saying, Dan, that's a nice generalization, but there's this, that, and the other. Can maybe just give us a little bit of thoughts about that, because I want to translate this into the boardroom. Boardrooms do have a good sense of who their core customers are and what's happening in their demographics, who their core labor force is, and where their future labor force and future customers are. And the wonderful thing about, you know, broad-based demographics is it's kind of knowable. If you're 34 now, I know in 6 years you will be 40, right? And you can kind of like, you can ask great questions about that as a board member and dig in. So this is, I think, you know, groundwork for people to do some follow-up. So you want to go first, Tim or Kevin, either one?
I'll happy to take a shot at a couple of things there. You know, from a board perspective, you know, one of the things that you do have influence and some degree of control over is training of the existing workforce. You know, so the reality is that we still have an educational system that largely caters to the idea of an industrialized economy. So in the K through 12, you know, it's a little more complicated than this, but to simplify, at the risk of oversimplifying, you're basically teaching people the skills to not be problems, follow instructions, show up, complete a task, maybe offer a little bit of critical thinking as you develop it over time. And that's kind of the model that an industrialized economy works with. There is nothing to say in our state of education today that someone who is, say, 45 to 60 can't learn entirely new skill sets. The reason that's been put aside is because under an industrialization model, you don't really need that kind of education and training, right? You just go through and you work for a long time and you get your pension or whatever, or your retirement savings, and you say goodbye and move on. So I think there is scope and opportunity to really double down on what you're doing with your existing employees to be able to train them, upskill them, create the conditions for them to be able to work in the areas where you see the fastest growth longer term. And so that to me presents some extraordinary opportunities that haven't really been tapped yet. Now, if we're going to continue with the same model, then you're still going to run the same challenges 10, 15 years from now. People decide I went to school for 16 years. I learned a little bit on an advanced level and I'm done. I just want to get my CPE and then get to the end. But I think that in terms of, you know, retention, maintaining a balance between what your hiring goals are versus your existing staff, that there is extraordinary opportunity to be able to take advantage and leverage the quality of life and quality of training that you're giving your existing workforce and creating a workforce that is going to match with where you're headed long term.
Great, thank you. Tim, what do you think?
It's like you took a picture of my office and you're just like, I've got a pile of soapboxes here, and I'm about to pull another one out and step on it. I completely agree with Kevin. I cannot say anything. This is a life goal. Don't say anything better than I can't say anything better than Kevin DePass. So I will just say what he said, but let me add a little bit of what has been. I'm gonna talk about what was going on in 2017 with truckers, because that's, I think, a good example of what Kevin just said. And I'm gonna bang on about millennials, of which I am one. Disclosure: I'm a millennial. I buy avocado toast. So here's the thing. Kevin is absolutely right. We have labor shortages going on. They're not getting better. Immigration will help with that. Different spots will benefit more. I think the day for ag and immigration is kind of behind us. When I was at the Fed, I used to talk to a bunch of ag growers out west. I'm in San Diego, and they'll tell you that they have long dealt with labor shortages and they've moved on. So I'm not sure that that's a spot where those will be alleviated. Having more labor will alleviate that. They're already doing stuff with cameras I never thought were possible. Now, going to the trucker situation though. So before the pandemic in 2016, 2017, 2018, there was a shortage of truckers. I mean, I'm talking epic shortage of truckers. So what do the trucking schools do? Exactly what Kevin just said. They opened up training facilities. They opened their doors, say, come in, we'll give you food, we'll train you. By the way, you can make 100K doing this. I mean, they went on a full blitz, and they didn't completely alleviate the shortage, but they made a significant inroads into that because they were willing to invest in their workforce. Let me give you another example of two things that I think are going to be huge, over three things actually in the next couple of years. And I'm saying this as a millennial. The three worst costs you can get hit with right now are healthcare, housing, and childcare. Those are things that as a company, if you're creative, and we saw some of this again before the pandemic, you can start to help folks with that. The housing is a little bit difficult, but the childcare and the medical care, companies before the pandemic were opening up clinics on site, right? Brought their costs down. They don't have like surgeons on site, but they had, initial, like, are you okay? Nurses, PAs, things like that. And they're opening childcare facilities. That sounds crazy, except for those of us who have young kids who are trying to buy a home in California, let me tell you, it is brutal. And guess what? Millennials are turning 40 soon. We are your next generation of management. And I've been telling clients this when I was at KPMG. I worked for a while as a senior economist at KPMG. I'd fly around the country talking to executives and boards. And I'd tell folks, I know you want people back in the office. Let me tell you, I know a whole list of millennials from here to the freeway that will die on the I'm not going back to the office hill because they have kids and they can't afford to live close to the city where the office is. And they're not going to make that change. And so as we think about the world and labor shortages as a director, exactly what Kevin said, you unfortunately, for those of you who are running companies, the power balance has shifted and it will shift for some time, even with immigration flows that we're seeing now. So how do we train our workforce and alleviate these three pressures in a way that will bring people in? Because you know what else? In a labor shortage, you want to be winning the war for talent, right? Recession or not. Even in our recession scenario, we don't have an unemployment rate going to 9. It's going to 5, 6, maybe. You're still going to have shortages of workers, particularly in certain areas. And so that's where you want to make yourself competitive with ancillary benefits. That's what I'll put.
Tim, despite your very youthful appearance, I suspect you may be on the older edge of the millennial. And so on behalf of Kevin and I, who I think is probably a young X, as I am, we would like to declare you a Zennial because you're too constructive. You're kind of in that in-between. You're thoughtful. X's, we all get forgotten because the boomers are big, the millennials are big. So we're just kind of stuck in the middle. Right, Kevin? I think
the
that's
flyover generation. That's who we are.
Exactly. No, it's exactly. We are like your equivalent of flyover generation. So we're going to declare Tim an honorary, So crossover, Zennial. It depends on the high school music you listen to, by the way, technically speaking. Okay, so I'm going to leave it where you stop there at this labor market, redeploying, current labor assets, how to do it in immigration. That's a great topic that probably deserves its own session. So we'll set that aside. I want to touch AI before we go to, we have 3 really great questions pending, including from Donna Wells, a really traditionalist question. And I'll give you the hint so you can be thinking about it. It's questions about capital stocks and flows, right? And is there a bunch of dry powder in the economy? What does that mean? Should we be using the traditional lens for that? Hint, GDP's a flow, not stock. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So be thinking about that in the back of your head. But I want to revisit AI just for a moment because it feels it's kind of in the same genre as all of this productivity, labor, retraining, etc. Do you want to give us, if you have any, hints about how directors sitting in the boardroom can more carefully incorporate questions or strategy or thinking about AI and its impacts, fast or slow, into what they're doing by maybe asking better questions, paying better attention to certain trends? Is there any suggestions you can give us about the feels really big and feels like it's moving at least pretty fast AI trend?
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to we've been here before. My kids think that all technology was invented, around 2000 or so. But you go back and you look over time that, whether it's the original industrial revolution, the impact of new technologies on the labor force, and on economic growth and on productivity. And so consistently you find that we have a tendency to overestimate productivity in the short run and underestimate it longer term. And the best example I think that's relevant for our age group to think through that is if you go back to 1999, look at the dot-coms, extraordinary amount, over I think over 80% of some of those original companies no longer even exist in that form. But everything that they promised, everything is true. And it's almost taken for granted now, 24 years later. So that to me is a similar, if not time frame, a similar unfolding of how the impact of artificial intelligence will be for our companies. Right now, what I see is a lot of promise about all the cool things that generative AI can do at the firm level. I don't see a lot of evidence of near-term productivity enhancement. It seems like a lot of the productivity enhancement is increasing the quality of your employee, and the efficiencies sort of accrue to them. It gives them more time to do things like childcare, go maybe a project that would take a 60-hour week takes 30 now. Those are the types of short-term efficiencies that I see at the firm level. Longer term, they're going to be extraordinary. And I think they're probably likely to be less labor displacement than what people are estimating. It's more likely that you're going to have augmented employees or training employees to be able to work with those tools in a way that does bring enterprise value. So that is still to come. We are still in the installation stage for that. The deployment stage is where those artificial intelligence efficiencies and gains and productivities come from. And we just don't know yet, is that 3 years from now, the way things are progressing, is it 5 or is it 10 or longer? And so that is the open question, and it's speculative to try to say what that is. But I think as an organization at the board level, you're keeping an eye on what is the real meaning for my organization to implement some of these very expensive tools. And are they going to deliver on what the investment is promising on the short term, or is it going to take longer to realize that return?
That's interesting. So distilling one thing you said, which maybe isn't super obvious, don't battle the intuition direction of the technology disruption, right? Like historically, the direction is proved out again and again. You know, it really does come down to the time frame. And even in the most exaggerated cases, take the 1950s flying car. Well, it looks like it's going to be directionally correct. It's just 70 years late, right? But it still arrived. And back to AI in terms of augmentation versus substitution, enhancement, and the accruing of that to the individual benefits. It reminds me of the world of safety enhancements in cars. At Stanford, we had a project on autonomous vehicles, but we brought in folks from Toyota, and they complained that American drivers in particular were really good at learning and absorbing the cool new stuff, anti-lock braking systems, auto stuff, and then altering their driving habits to push them right back to the original accident rate by absorbing the safety of that, right? It was a very funny kind of thing. And it sounds like a lot of what's happening in AI is now is doing some of that, where it improves my productivity. I can do a draft fast. Now it takes me 40 minutes instead of 55 minutes, and I'm working from home, so maybe I get a little bit more quality family time or something. So, but long run, and it's not 50 years, right? Like we're not debating between 50, 70, and 30 years. We're kind of debating between 4, 8, 16 years. Like, you know, it's hard to say, but it's probably certainly within our lifetime. So do you want anything to add to that, Tim? I really like that, Kevin. That's a good framing.
Yeah, just one thing to think about as a board level. So I alluded to this in my previous comments. AI is not new. It's machine learning. We've had it in economics for actually 2 decades, right? So it's really a lot of statistics. And there's actually a fight within the economics profession around machine learning versus like more traditional macroeconomic time series analysis. They're similar, but not always the same. Here's the thing. Machine learning took everything around statistics and put it on steroids. And we're at the point now where the people building this stuff don't understand it. It's just a giant model with lots of variables and assumptions and things, and now it's feeding itself and learning from it. That's very powerful. It's also dangerous. And if you're a director, if the folks building it have trouble explaining it, imagine what it feels like sitting there trying to manage the folks that are building it, right? So here's what we work on, and I got a front row seat to this. One of my mentors and someone I respect, the power of questions. His name's Mark Gould. He's the chief executive vice payments for the Fed now. He used to be the COO at the SF Fed. This guy could turn a conversation with a question. He doesn't. These things are so big. You can't expect to have a question that is like specific on a specific model. The idea around asking the right questions in the boardroom is, one, feeling comfortable doing it. There are no bad questions. If you don't understand, let me just go back to 3rd grade. If you don't understand, 5 other people don't understand as well. So there are no bad questions, especially if you have a little bit of knowledge. Second, ask people how they've done it and what they've done, right? So they'll get up there, they'll give you a presentation. Look at all these fancy bells and whistles. The first question I always tell clients and I always tell board members to ask is, well, where would your model break, right? They should be able to answer that question. If you don't like the answer to that question, red flag number 1. The second thing you should ask, and this is only need 2 questions, is what could go right in the other direction, right? Where could we have missed both in terms of this model breaking, and where may you have underdone it, right? Those 2 things will often give you a sense when you look at them and see how they respond. Those 2 things will give you a sense of the strength of the data culture, of the strength of that team, which as a board member, that's what you're assessing. You're not assessing the model. That's not your job. Your job is to assess the culture of the team. So those cultural questions are immensely powerful when you're assessing this kind of data stuff. That's how I look at it.
That is really, I wrote that down. That is absolutely great. Thank you. And I will admit that in terms of AI and economics, the kind of intersection of all this stuff, only economists would know this of a certain age. So Harry Seldon is the only hero in all of science fiction literature, Asimov's trilogy series, who's an economist and the protagonist and the hero of the whole story, where he gets to predict everything in the future using economics tools. So like, you know, about a third of my colleagues who all went to PhD econ at Stanford we admitted deep down that we wanted to be Harry Seldon, right? Like you wanted to be the foundation trilogy guy. See, I can tell, particularly Kevin knows this. Tim, you might actually be a millennial and too young to know, which is okay. All right, so we have two questions. One is short. I'm going to ask Tim to answer because I was pleasantly surprised. Tim, you're absolutely qualified to answer this. One of the questions came up that, hey, upcoming election, is the Fed going to put his finger on the scale or not? Like, are they going to alter the balance? Like, what, and the person is skeptical. I think the trope is almost, hey, the Fed always helps a little, right? The current, what do you think, and what's your evidence?
Let me give you a very short answer. Unequivocally, no. I've been in those conversations for a period of time. Not once in 5 years of these discussions have I ever heard someone bring up politics. I know from other folks who went through a process to become Fed presidents or governors, those questions come up from presidents. Every president, including this president, tries to weigh in on the scales. But generally, outside of the last one, the firewall is pretty good. And so I can tell you with unequivocal and absolute certainty that while it may seem like that, those discussions around whether we should lower or raise rates have nothing to do with politics. They have a lot to do with inflation data, though.
Yeah, and your career at the highest level on the inside straddled John Williams, who was president of the San Francisco Fed, is now president of the New York Fed, and Mary Daly, who is now president of San Francisco Fed. So you have a pretty good cross-section of authority. So I appreciate that answer. That is reassuring. We have a fiercely independent Fed from a global viewpoint. It's nice to hear it confirmed from the inside. Okay, so last question, which we'll let you both weigh in on. It's a good end. Is the last one we haven't answered. It goes to Donna Wells' point, which is, capital stocks and flows. Like if you're using a traditional lens on this, don't we have a bunch of dry powder laying around? What's happening? What will be the implications of that? Isn't there a bunch of, capacity to deploy and so give us your maybe 1 minute version of that with the final conclusion, and I'll have you incorporate is be looking for this thing, if there is one, or be sure to ask this question. So at the end of your answer, give us as directors a hint, like be sure to ask this question in the coming months or quarters, or be sure to look for X, Y, or Z. So Kevin, can I have you go first on this one? Just kind of stocks and flows.
Sure, and to think about it from the board perspective, I mean, you've seen this firsthand from 2009 to 2019 when, especially in the early stages of that recovery, there was limited visibility. So you had price instability from a deflationary perspective. And that created the conditions where when you don't have price stability, you have very challenged investment visibility. So now that we are at a point where the Fed is close to achieving price stability, my expectation is that that investment visibility opens up. And what I mean by that, venture capitalists put it to me last summer that and from his view, we're in a 15-50 environment where their targets believe they're worth 50 million, the venture capitalist believes they're worth 15. So how do you narrow that bid-ask spread? Well, the way you do that is, back in the summer when you had interest rates rising without clarity of when the Fed would be able to achieve price stability, you cannot have true investment visibility if you don't have price stability, period. And that's how you make those decisions. So now what I look for is that, yes, there is a significant amount of so-called dry powder, whether it's in private equity or cash on the sidelines, that can go to other cash instruments. We'd have a competitive environment now where short-term rates, you look at the 2-year near 4.6% or so. That's an attractive investment vehicle versus it was either equities or nothing or private equity in the Great Recession. So right. We're almost there, and I think that that you will start to see that dry powder become more material once we're at full conditions of price stability.
Fantastic. All right, it's up to you, Tim. You have last word for 1 minute.
1 minute. I can't say better than Kevin again. So everything he said, the one thing I will put though to watch out for, the monthly growth rate in core PC inflation. Why am I banging on about this? Because people look, you get report the 12-month, the yearly change gets reported. That's the Fed's target. What matters is the monthly growth rate and the trajectory of those monthly growth rates. To hit 2%, you need a monthly growth rate of 0.165 for 12 quarters. We are nowhere close to that. So what happened with the recent inflation data and at the latest FOMC has me very concerned that the headlines and the markets are misunderstanding where policy is going. Inflation's about to stall out at 2.5 unless we get some really weak readings. I don't think that that's a place the Fed's going to cut, especially after we just had a hiccup. It went low, inflation lowered, and then went up at the beginning of the year. So keep your eye on what's going on in the Treasury market. Keep your eye. We think there's significant upward risk to the 10-year Treasury yield, and we think that there's probably only one cut this year. And so if that's true, then you are going to see borrowing costs not only that are high, but remain at the current levels. And that is a risk to people that are borrowing, or to all of Kevin's points about yields. So watch the monthly growth rate in inflation, not the 12-month monthly growth rate.
That's a great end, which leaves us wanting more. So we are out of time. I don't know about the audience, but I've had a great time. So thanks for having the conversation. We really appreciate your insight. Look forward to having you come back on. We'll mix it up with maybe a little bit of other stuff, but really had a good time. Thanks again. Nancy will always remind me if I've forgotten anything, but thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Tim. Thanks also to our sponsors. We'll talk to you soon. Have a wonderful week.